All right, everyone, welcome back on the Shot of E&J podcast. This is your boy, Eric Igwe, with Jeremy Minster, co-host, and we have our special guest, Professor Bradley. And so before we start on our topic on the war on drugs and impacts on communities, I want to give a shout-out to Hit Culture Digital for producing this set. They've been with us, putting these episodes together. Exemplary work, so please look up Hit Culture Digital. Don't forget Hit Culture with a K, all right? So hitculturedigital.com. So please look it out, check them out, utilize them fully. We thank them. So, Jeremy, go ahead and introduce our special guest, and let's get into this topic, war on drugs.
Right. Well, before we get into some of the questions, Professor Bradley, if you could just tell the people about some of your work that you've done so much. Not enough can be said about your engagement with the community and your research on different things with all kinds of topics, drug related. So talk to the people, man, about what you do.
No, man. Yeah. So I got a PhD in transatlantic history from UTA in 2014. And what's interesting is I didn't start that degree out thinking I'd be a historian of drugs, which I wouldn't consider myself that. I'm more of a cultural historian who uses drugs to understand culture, right? And so I started as a Russian historian, in fact. And when I got into UTA, I was looking at a transatlantic dimension, trying to figure out how I can incorporate Russia, because that was my love. That's what got me into history. And when I started kind of like keyword searching Russia in the diplomatic correspondence online database, I started to kind of find this connection between Russia and the United States and this word hemp, which really got me into a whole huge kind of rabbit hole about hemp, which transformed into cannabis, which transformed into the war on drugs. And so I've been working at Tarrant County College for the past 11 years or so, teaching a specific course called World History Through the Lens of Commodities. And so we take a commodity and we talk about history through the lens of sugar, opium, cannabis, right, tobacco, and drugs, of course, are a very important part of the U.S. and world history as well. So that really is what kind of led me down this path. And so it's been an interesting journey. You know, I've been there since 2014. I was at Tarrant County College since even before 2014. I got the job in the middle of my PhD program, but I've been marrying sort of my interest, my teaching interest in U.S. history and world history with this transatlantic connection, which is what got me into drug culture and history.
Nice.
Absolutely. So we got an expert, y'all, like 100%, right? 1,000%. So let's get into this conversation about drugs. So, and this is kind of open-ended. So Professor Bradley, you can take us where you want to, but what do you think is really relevant about the history of drugs, especially in I would say the last 30 to 40 years in America? What are some, key events? What are some trends? What are some things that you've noticed, through your study and your research?
Yeah, that's a great question. The history of drugs in the United States, like the rest of the world, is a complex subject. When you think about drugs, there's all kinds of terms that come to mind, right? We got healing, we got pain, we got struggle, we got problem, we got help. And drugs is a blanketed term that we use to kind of apply to various different substances that we use in our bodies. And I would sort of pinpoint the 19th century as the rise of what we call the cult of pharmacology, where we begin to kind of transform our belief in magic and things like this into pharmacology, into chemistry and things like this. And so people begin to think, I use the term cult of pharmacology, as Richard de Grandpré did in the title of his book with that title, as to be a kind of term to represent how people come to invest meaning into the consumption of drugs. We think that we tend to think since the 19th century, for example, that the chemical of a drug is what affects you. And what we know now from de Grandpré's work and others is that It's not just the actual pharmacology of a drug that affects you. It's also the cultural world and you live in that tells you what happens to you when you consume a drug, as well as your psychological state when you consume a drug, that all three combine together to create what we would call a high. So it's not just the substance that you consume that's having an effect on you. There's all these other things that go into what happens to someone when they consume a drug. And this we call the psychoactive riddle, right? We don't know which of the three are more important, but we do know that what your society tells you happens to you when you consume a drug, along with your psychological state when you consume a drug, combined with the pharmacology, has a tremendous influence or impact on what happens to you once you do consume that drug. And I think that's an important point that people tend to miss when they focus primarily on the drug, right? Yeah. We focus primarily on the drug when there's all these other things going on. Like, Carl Hart, who's an excellent neuropsychopharmacologist at Columbia University, is fond of saying, if you have a 12-year-old child who's on heroin, I promise you that child has far more problems in their life than the heroin. But we focus just on the heroin.
That's real.
We don't focus on what's going on in the rest of their life, which could help them get off that situation.
Got you. So there's other factors that we definitely need to consider.
Definitely.
And it's sort of like we vilify the drug use and the drug user in particular a lot of times and criminalize them.
Right.
In terms of, and Igwe, you can get in here too as well, with your thoughts. In terms of the, I guess the political movements that have taken place, the criminalization of drugs in America. In particular, I know, big topic now is about decriminalization of marijuana or whatnot.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that? Because we're at a time now where it's real sexy to be like, okay, lower level drug offenses, we're not really prosecuting those cases for a lot of, district attorney offices, or we're not really trying to pursue that. But what are your thoughts on it politically? What has the government done, and what should they be doing for the, the quote unquote, the drug problem?
The drug problem. I think we need to focus on that concept right there. Is how much of a problem is the drug problem besides what we've created? We've created a problem more so than anything else. We think of the term war on drugs, for example. What does that really mean? How can you wage a war on an inanimate object that can't fight back?
Yeah.
When you think about war, you're supposed to be fighting against somebody who can fight back. You're talking about a war on drugs. Really what you mean is a war on culture, a war on cultural uses for a particular substance, right? And so where does this come from? Why do we vilify particular uses for substances? That is where you get into the real nitty-gritty of what's going on, right? You don't have a drug law in this country that's not based off racism. You don't have a drug law in this country that emerged without the context of a fear of some foreign, other, non-American, not true American consumption of a substance that's perceived as a problem. And I think that's where we need to start. If we want to really understand the so-called drug problem, we got to understand how we create that problem. Joseph Gusfield wrote a really good book about drinking and driving and the symbolic culture of creating public problems. And what goes into creating a public problem is far more than the particular substance. We like to look at the substance as a scapegoat, but really there's a lot more underlining issues going on.
So I want to go more into, some people say the problem is, so let's talk more about the war on drugs in the 80s, the quote unquote war on drugs, right? Reagan administration came in. It has really, drugs got into the community. So people want to get, it decimated African Americans, black folks in the community. Black folks were going to jail in high rates, right? But no one wants to talk about how the drugs got into there. Everybody just want to say, oh, the drugs got in here. Shame on black folks. We're going after black folks. But no one want to talk about how the drugs got in here. So can you provide some context on the quote-unquote war on drugs in the 80s and the impact it's had on African Americans?
Yeah, I mean, you've heard things about Oliver North and the Iran Contra and all these other things. But I would even focus more on the fact that, crack, for example, emerges in 1984, 1985. And we already saw a surge of problems, of crime in black communities before that. So how are we going to blame crack for a surge of problems that emerged in the early 80s, right? And so what happens is we do a really good job in vilifying drugs. We do a really good job in blasting media images of new things that people don't know about to create and instill fear that actually doesn't work out. I mean, we had problems well before crack showed up, right? And we like to blame the crack because it's easy. It's a scapegoat. We can look at the crack. We can say this is the problem. We can spend all our research on the crack. We can spend all of our money and influence on attacking the crack. And really, there's other underlining issues like poverty, like lack of opportunity, like all these other types of things that cause people to develop adverse relationship with drugs, right? There's no such thing as a good or bad drug. There's only good or bad relationships with drugs. People develop bad relationships with drugs for a number of different reasons that have nothing to do with the drugs themselves. The fact of the matter is you can pick the most vilified drug, you just name it, whatever you want. You'd pick the most vilified drug, and the vast majority of people who've ever consumed that drug never develop a problem with that drug. Look at something like heroin, where less than 28%, 29% of people who ever stick a needle in their arm develop a problem with heroin. But if you grew up like I grew up, you were convinced by the time you were 15 years old that the minute you stick a needle in your arm, you're an addict and there's nothing's going to happen to you. You're messed up. You're washed up. The fact of the matter is that 70-something% of people who stick a needle in their arm don't end up developing a problem with it, go about paying their taxes, become normal, okay citizens. But we blow this stuff up. We like to create problems, exacerbate problems, because there is a problem. Since 1999, almost 1 million people have died of overdoses, right?
Yeah.
So that's a problem. Those are lives that didn't have to die. Those are lives that ended up dying because of ignorance rather than anything else, right? We want to blame the drug, the overdose. Well, if you would have taught somebody how to protect themselves, harm reduction, then half them lives probably would have been saved in the first place. So are you really concerned with helping people out? Or are you trying to create a problem that you can throw money at and, you know?
Yeah. So you mentioned our Contra Affair. So for those who don't know, in the 80s, you had former President Reagan at that time, so the government, U.S. government back then played a lot of role in trying to topple these Central American governments because they were bringing in communism, right? All about promoting democracy. But Nicaragua was one of those countries, right? And so the Sandinista government came in, took over. U.S. Reagan didn't like it, saying it's a communist country. So he wanted to go and fund the rebels, who were called the Contras. There was an amendment that essentially said, back in, I think, the 50s, a Boland Amendment, which you cannot provide military support aid to them. They found a way to provide aid by going through Iran, selling arms through Iran, using the funds from that, and then putting that funds to help put money into the Contras. But there's also stories from like Gary Webb and other media that felt like, hey, the Contras came in the 80s. They felt like the CIA or the U.S. government played a part in bringing the drugs into the black communities in L.A. When people hear about, Free Rick Ross, he wasn't Ricky Ross. He was in the mix because back then the reports about Contra people coming into the United States using Ricky Ross to go ahead and sell drugs, turn cocaine into crack and sell it into the community, and then using those profits. And some people are wondering whether those profits are used to help fund the war and whether the CIA directly, people are wondering, speculating whether the CIA directly or indirectly not only knew it, but let it happen to help support those Contras. So what's your thoughts? Do you feel like the government and CIA actually played a role in it? Knows a lot of speculative. People already want to dispute it for whatever reason, but what's your thoughts on that?
I mean, I don't have any more thoughts of what you just said. I mean, you've summed it up pretty well. I mean, that's what we're dealing with right now. You got all these backdoor deals going on, and I would say you need to go back way further than the Iran Contra in the 1980s, man. In fact, you need to even go further back than the Nixon administration, where they started talking about the war on drugs and the scheduling and all these other things, you need to go back much further. I think you need to go back to the late 19th century, right? You need to go back to the late 19th century when, prior to the late 19th century, the average white middle-class woman used to consume 100 drops of laudanum a day just to get by, and no one called her an addict. But then you got all these Chinese immigrants coming in who use opium for different purposes, and now you start to see the first kind of vilification of drug consumption, right? This relates to the Iran-Contra. It's the same kind of thing, right? If you can create fear in the minds of people of a substance that you consider to be so dangerous that if you touch it, you're going to overdose, then you can get those people to give up tremendous amount of liberties in support of waging a lot of war against them. And so this is the real issue. You got all these backdoor deals going on in the 1980s, but by that time, drugs have already become so mystified that people are willing to believe anything. And this is the real issue. What is a drug? What is a substance? Why do we fear the consumption of a substance so much that we're willing to destroy people's lives to try to end some kind of, which doesn't even make any sense. There's never in the history of the world been a drug-free society. There's never been a drug-free society. Drugs are one of the most important benefits to mankind. They help us function, right? When you think about drugs, you think about what is a drug? Alcohol is a drug, but we like to call them drugs and alcohol as if they're entirely different substances, right? In fact, the two most dangerous drugs, alcohol and tobacco, are legal in this country, right? So you got to really think about, it goes way beyond the Iran-Contra, man. You got to really think about what it means to be to consider a substance being illicit. If you ever look at any kind of drug law in this country, man, it's predicated on fear and racism. It's something other than the drug itself. There is no such thing as a good or bad drug. There's only good or bad relationships with drugs. If you get mauled by a bear in the middle of the woods, I promise you, heroin may save your life. Right? But I mean, you hear people talking about, oh, well, this is just a horrible. Anybody who consumes heroin is problematic. You think about, we focus on the consumption rather than the reason for consumption. That's really the key. If you really are interested in helping people, if you're really interested in improving people's lives, then you won't focus on the mere consumption. You'll focus on the purpose of consumption, which will lead you into understanding why someone has a problem in the first place.
We got to get to the break. So when we get back on our break, we're going to go more into this discussion. This is really enlightening. So stay tuned on the Shot of E&J podcast.